Hey students, this is your Professor Omelianchuk, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about health and disease concepts. Right, so to warm up here, I want you to consider this NPR story that I saw online the other day. It's only the other day too, right? May 28th, 2019. And the question is here is just that is gaming disorder an illness? Right? What do you think about that? Right? The World Health Organization says yes, and added to its list of disease. You can listen to that story, right? I got a couple of links here. You can read it if you'd like, and tell me what you think. Why or why not? All right? Why or why not? Now, once you kind of get into that story, it's probably going to lead you into the idea of the disease model of addiction. Right? So addiction has been classified as a disease for a very long time. You can kind of see why at this website if you're interested. I link to it here in my lecture notes. And one of the things that just lists here is that, well, addiction can be a combination of behavioral, environmental, and biological factors. Right? There's genetic risks. There's changes in the functioning of the brain and the body, and these things can be brought on by risky behavior, or they can just pre-exist. Maybe you have like an addictive personality or something like that. Okay, consequences of not treating it, well, can include other major physical, mental health disorders. Okay, and they can be life-threatening. So you might think of an alcoholic, okay, and who damages his liver and needs a liver transplant. So it can be really big deal, right? And so anyway, the idea behind the disease model, right, one of the social goals of it, right, it's not just purely a scientific idea, but it's to call out for help, or to advance the imperative to help. To advance the imperative to help, right, and not shame people or criminalize people, right? This is one of the things that people are really worried about in drug treatment. Okay. Right, when you're thinking about that too, you might think of common objections to the idea of the disease model of addiction. You might think the disease model is something that really, unfairly stigmatizes things, right, as risky, right, so or harmful, when they may not be. So things like sex, can you really be addicted to sex? Doesn't that kind of stigmatize what sex is? It's this addictive thing, right? Or it's risky. Television, gaming, right? So people object that what you're doing here, right, is when you make addiction into a disease model, you make the objects of addiction into disease-causing agents when they're not, right? So that's kind of the big idea. You might also think that the disease model treats sufferers, right, as agentless victims who should not be held responsible for their choices, right? But it's false. We do this all the time. There's nothing wrong with doing this too. Okay, that's one thing that gets kind of pushed around in this debate, right? It's like, wait a second, no. Drug addicts do all kinds of dumb things and hurt people. They should be held responsible. Who cares if they have a disease, right? Maybe they don't have a disease at all. Maybe they just make dumb, poor choices. Okay. Then you have objections that say things like the disease model, right, seems to imply that you need to seek a medical treatment to solve it. But a lot of people don't. Okay, so why do we medicalize it like that? All right. So anyway, I bring this up because I think this is in the background of this question here. And look, if you're attracted to the disease model, how would you respond to these objections? Okay. Do you find any of them compelling if you don't like the disease model? Right? So think about that. And for those of you who might want to write a paper about this issue, a term paper, there's this really interesting paper that was published in the Lancet here about the brain disease model of addiction and whether or not it's really supported by evidence and whether it's delivered on its social promises. Is it something that is really helping people? Is it advancing the imperative to help? Okay. And this paper gets into that stuff. So it's an interesting topic. And I think it's what's relating in the background here about this gaming disorder. All right, so let's get into one of today's articles that you had to read. All right, do you have a syndrome if you have a flat-shaped head? All right, so, who is this joker that wrote this paper, huh? Here he is. And what does he have to say? Well, one of the things that he's up to in this paper here, I'll tell you about it, is he had to write basically what's called a summary article. It's kind of a teaser article for the journal. So there's a journal that's got 4 or 5 very complicated long papers in it, and instead of having to kind of sit down and read each one, right, you have an author that's invited to write about each of the articles, and that author's job is to summarize and promote the articles as interesting. And so that was what my job was here, and so that's what this paper is, right? And so it's nice though, because it does kind of have this interesting case that I want it to be our controlling case for our thought experiments and how we test our intuitions about health and disease concepts. So the case, as you read, right, involves this little baby girl, right, who's got a flat side of her head, right? They see this is caused by a sleeping habit, right? You can't lay little babies on their tummies, right? Because that's what, even though they want that, the risk of sudden infant death syndrome goes way up, and so you're supposed to swaddle them and lay them in their crib flat on their back. And little babies, their necks aren't very strong, and so they just kind of favor one side. And since their skulls are soft and pliable, they tend to kind of flatten out in this, right? So at the 4-month checkup, they talk to the pediatrician about it, and she doesn't even notice it, right? She's like, oh, your baby's healthy. And then the parents point out this feature of her head, and she kind of goes, oh yeah, well, if you want to get a consultation, you can see this place. What they'll do is they'll dress her down to her diaper and get the contour of her head, take some photographs of it, and then do a side-by-side comparison, where you got your baby's head, right, next to some nameless baby's head, which is perfectly round, okay? And then the consultation then says, well, look, here's what we can do. We can give you this little cranial helmet that will imperceptibly reshape the baby's head to look like the normal baby's head. Right now, there's all kinds of questions that come up, right? Is there really a health benefit to doing this? And in severe cases, yes, there is. Right? You can have a severe case of a flat-sided head or a misshapen skull, and it's good to get this done so you will avoid like these orthodontic problems, right? Or the TMJ problems. Okay, you want to avoid those. Right? You don't have to worry about brain problems or anything like that, brain development. It's all going to work out, right? However, there's some other things that might be important, right? You have things like noticeable facial asymmetries, or poorly fitting glasses, sporting equipment, that kind of stuff. And the parents in this case said, you kind of have a borderline mild to moderate case. All right, so what do you want to do? And the father's not too interested in pursuing treatment, right? Because there's just no guarantee that the company's going to, the insurance company is going to pay for it, right? Because again, right, is this a disease or is this something that's just cosmetic, all right? However, the mother, right, says, well, look, men and women experience disease categories differently. She actually doesn't say this, but she understands that these kinds of problems here can affect girls more so than boys. Right? And so she's trying to communicate with her husband and say, look, this can be really important, right? And if we don't do something now, we might regret it later. And our daughter might even ask us, why didn't you take care of this, right? And so how are you going to answer her then? And so they tried to move forward with treatment, but the insurance company just would not commit. And then after a few months, the baby's head started to round out a little bit more, a little bit of time, a little tummy time, and a little bit of growing, and the syndrome just didn't seem to matter so much anymore. And the pediatrician says, you have nothing to worry about, and so they didn't pursue treatment. Okay, so the case does describe some interesting things that come up in our discussions about health, right? We talk about health. What exactly is health? What does it mean to be healthy, right? Can you be healthy and have a flat-shaped head, right? That seems like an important question, right? What exactly is a disease, right? That does matter. Being classified a disease, it's not just a scientific idea, right? We have a government agency in our country called the Centers for Disease Control. And diseases are meant to be controlled, right? That's what they're, that's okay. It's permissible to control diseases, if anything, right? Surely we can agree on that. And so you might think that having a flattened part of your head counts as one, or maybe not, right? And so one of the things we worry about, especially with values, is like, well, you know, if it's all about controlling people, right, and their bodies, we might want to have, a disease concept that can be describable in value neutral terms. And so that way, right, science is getting the say so here and not just some, social construction that we have in the back of our minds. Okay, we don't want to rely on social constructions when it comes to controlling people. We want science to be, provide us with those good reasons. Okay, all right. So we get into questions about what counts as normal, right? What does it mean to have a normal head, right, and an abnormal head, right? And when we ask those kind of questions, we might be wondering, well, is there something dehumanizing that occurs to people, when we start kind of, searching their eyes for searching their bodies for defects, right, and trying to find problems that need fixing. Okay, and could that be exacerbated when we have, big pharma involved, right, and people wanting to advance research agendas? Okay, it's not unheard of for pharmaceutical companies to kind of just invent a disease. Like, hey, we have this drug, and it can help with that. So you might think that, how we classify things as diseases and what constitutes health is actually going to be something that's fraught with value issues, right? It's not going to be something that's purely scientific. Right. So let's talk a little bit about health and disease. I don't want to. We'll get into some of the issues about disease being value neutral or not in the next lecture about Boer's and Englehart's papers, right? But today I just want to kind of go over what a classical idea of health is and contrast it with the non-classical or modern idea of health. Right. So let's kind of just talk about the classical idea here for a minute, right? That involves the well-functioning of the human organism as a whole. Now, on this view, to function well involves the idea of proper function. Okay, so there's a way things are supposed to be on this view. Okay, and it is a normative concept. The classical view embraces the normative concept, right? But it thinks that it's kind of a natural idea. All right, so the natural and the normative go together on the classical view, right? So how organs and how biological processes within the body, and just even how the organism as a whole is supposed to function, has a definitive answer, right? And so Aristotle is a big name that gets brought up about kind of pushing this idea, right? He had this idea called a form, right? So the form of the body, right? And everything has a form. Tables have a form, right? Chairs have a form. Trees have a form, okay? That form specifies the way the thing is supposed to be. And so for the human organism, the form specifies the way the human's supposed to be. Okay? And this is what's called formal causation. Now, I don't want to get too into this, right? Aristotle has 4 causes. There's formal cause. There is the final cause, efficient cause, and material cause, right? I don't want to get into explaining that too much because it'll take us too far afield, right? But these 2 kinds of causes, formal and final causation, are not part of the modern view, right? So this idea of what specifies the way things are supposed to be, the formal cause, and then the final cause, which is what are things supposed to be doing? What is their end goal? What's their purpose, right? That kind of stuff is big in Aristotle, right? So things like organs, right? The organs in your body, right, are meant to fulfill certain purposes. Okay, now, especially if you're of a Roman Catholic persuasion and you follow the teachings of Thomas Aquinas, who adapted Aristotle's ideas and his Christian theology, right? What you're going to do is understand that the sex organs are for procreation. Okay, they are not for other things, right? Like masturbating or having sex that is non-procreative. So things like oral sex or anal sex. That's just a misuse of the body, right? Breasts. Those are used for feeding newborns, okay? They're not meant for modeling or enhancing, for a photographer or something like that to produce, I don't know what, Playboy magazine or something like that, okay? That's not what they're for, right? So on this view, right, you have a normative view of the body, and the body can be misused. Now, you might be a nonconformist who likes to walk on your hands, okay? And there might be something kind of fun and interesting about that. We might see that in a circus. But the idea is that it belongs in a circus. Right? If you were to make a practice of walking on your hands, your doctor would tell you that that's bad for your body because your hands are not meant to bear the weight of your body, unlike your ankles and feet. Okay? So, look, the classical idea is fallen on hard times. Okay, it's not in vogue. However, some of its concepts are still around in medicine. This is true. All right, and especially when it comes to understanding the purposes of organs. Organ health is often determined by whether or not those organs are performing their functions. Okay, so look. I know it's kind of strange. You might think, well, gosh, doesn't this have like some implications for how we should think about contraception? And the answer is yes, and that's all very controversial. All right. However, the idea, it doesn't have to be controversial, right? It's usually controversial when it comes to sex organs, right? But when it comes to things like your heart, right, that's meant to pump blood, right? And if it's not doing that well, then it's not a good organ. Okay, and that is a classical idea, right? So I just introduced that to you to give you some background because that's part of the discussion of what health is, and it's still one that's prominent, though it has fallen out of favor. Okay, modern ideas, while Aristotle's metaphysics are rejected, so we don't have this formal and final causation. All we care about is like efficient causation. And efficient causation, an example of that is, the cue ball knocking the 8 ball into the corner pocket, right? It's what action leads to another action, right? And then you have material causation. So, why is it that the salt dissolves in water? Well, it's in virtue of the kind of material it is, right? That's a way of thinking about material causation. It isn't the only way. All right, but it's one that moderns like to accept, okay? And so the idea with modern views of health, right, once you kind of get away from this stuff, it's hard to kind of characterize what health is, but these are some examples, right, that some modern thinkers have put forward, right? So it's the idea here to perform certain abilities, okay? So to be healthy is to be able-bodied, right, to be independent. Okay, so one of the things that people really fear at the end of life is being dependent upon others, right? And that's interesting. Okay, and that's a health concept because it's a view of the body, right? And it's one that is pathologized in such a way that sometimes people think, okay, if I'm fully dependent on others, I'm in a physical state where I want to accept death. You don't have to euthanize me, all right? But you can withdraw life support, okay? And that's an interesting health concept. I mean, as little babies, we come into the world, many of us very healthy, but we are totally dependent on people. Okay, so you might think, well, what's the deal here? How does that health concept apply to babies rather than to old people? Okay, it's an interesting question. Other ones have to do with realizing one's goals. Okay, and what is it that you want to achieve in life? So think of football players. Right, they have certain goals. Right. They want to win the Super Bowl. They want to win the game. Linemen want to block the defenders. Okay, quarterbacks want to complete their passes, right? And so it takes a certain kind of body to do this kind of thing, right? And so a healthy football player, right, is one who can do these things and do them well, right? And so what does the team doctor do then? Well, make sure that they're healthy enough to play, okay? And so health becomes about achieving certain goals. Right, so you can see how this might get controversial when concussions enter into the issue. All right, concussions weren't seen to be a health problem because they didn't really interfere all that much with the play of the game. I mean, now maybe you had to come out because you were too confused, right? But nowadays in the NFL, you just have to be out for like one play, and you can come back in. All right, because from a football standpoint, it's like, well, if you can block and tackle, then you're healthy, okay? So that's an idea, right? And then the World Health Organization has this one. Health is just a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, right? And so you can kind of understand how physical health kind of gets in there, well-being. Mental well-being, okay, all right. But then social well-being? So, if you live in a crime-ridden neighborhood, or if you are under some oppressive totalitarian regime or a horrible, violent patriarchy, right? That's can be deemed a health problem by the World Health Organization, right? So a very wide and expansive view of health on that. And speaking of which, what I do is I put together this little continuum here. On the classical view, you have this kind of narrow conception of health, right? And that's Aristotle. On the modern view, right, you get into more expansive ones. So here you have Boers, right? He's a little bit closer to Aristotle, even though he tries to critique Aristotle a bit. You have the WHO, and then Engelhardt, at least in the writing that we're going to be reading for this class, I mean, he just kind of thinks disease categories are just really all about social control, and that's all there is to it. That's kind of when he was writing this paper, and he seems to suggest that. So I think he evolved later on, and he has a much more sophisticated view. In all fairness to Engelhardt, he is a really great philosopher, so I want to pay respect to him. But in the purposes of this class, he's very much on the side of the modern view. Right, so just think of this as kind of a continuum. When it comes to health concepts, right, we have choices to make no matter what kind of health concept we develop. Right, so I just want to go over these kind of quickly here. We have naturalism versus normativism. Sometimes this is a false dichotomy, right? So we saw this on the classical view, that these two actually kind of go together. But in modern settings, right, there is this question about our health concept, is it purely descriptive of physical facts? Or are we importing some normative concept about how a human life and well-being should be, right? Like I said, on the classical view, these two kind of go together. They collapse into one another. In the modern views, well, they can be separated, right? So Boers is going to want to do this, all right? And then people like Engelhardt try and say, well, this is what's really going on, okay? Reductionism versus holism. All right, so, is our health concept just about body parts or the organism as a whole? Sometimes you hear this issue come up about treating the disease rather than the patient, right? And treating diseases, that can be kind of reductionistic, right? You might want to treat the whole person. You don't want to just treat symptoms. You want to kind of treat, well, what's going on in the whole body, right? This is an issue, this often comes up in like alternative medicine issues. Alternative medicine is thought to be more holistic, right? Take into account everything. Whereas modern medicine is just, everybody gets so specialized in their own little discipline, and they just become focused on body parts, right? Okay, so those are issues to work out. Okay, then we have internalism versus circumstantialism. Okay, so health, does it only refer to the internal states of the body, or does it also include external circumstances? Remember in the WHO's definition, right? We saw things like social conditions being incorporated into our health concept, right? Social conditions are going to be external circumstances, right? To the internal state of the body. Then we have universalism versus relativism. So some people think that health is relative to the cultural values and standards of individuals and societies. Okay, so health on the football field is going to be a very different thing than health in outer space, or health as a newborn, or health in India, or health in France. Okay, these, health in Oregon, and the naturalistic, homeopathic, vaccine hesitant communities of Oregon versus, right, health in Mississippi. Okay, so you might think that there's something relative going on here, right? Or is health something that's universal, right? We have a human nature, and anybody who's human, right? Anything that is human has a certain kind of healthy life form that we can appeal to, right? It's kind of a health without borders idea, all right? And then we have subjectivism versus objectivism, and that is really about issues to what extent the perspective of the subject to determine one's health status. So you might have people coming in to your doctor's office and say, I'm not healthy. And you do an exam and they look just fine. And you're like, well, what's the deal? How much of their word do you take into account? You don't want to just discount people's testimonies entirely, right? Because people, right, know their own bodies from the inside out, right? And so you might have to work something out here when it comes to health concepts, okay? So for reflection, when you consider these should be 5 debates, right? To which side do you tend to lean, right? You're gonna probably lean one way or the other, and I want you to describe your view, right? How do you understand health? Okay, how do you understand health, and how you answer, at least which way do you lean? It doesn't mean that you're all the way on one side and not the other, but what way do you lean? Okay, talk about that. Think about that. All right, last thing of this lecture I want to go over that I think is kind of important. This wasn't in my article so much. I allude to it in a footnote, but it is something I think is important. Okay. Sometimes diseases, let's put that in italics, and disabilities are distinguished from one another. All right, and so what's going on here is that the disease is a medical category, all right, and that should be controlled, while disability is a political category that should be protected. All right. Okay. So let's highlight those words because those are important, right? We talked about the Centers for Disease Control. Diseases should be controlled. Yeah, that seems right. I mean, if anything, that seems correct. What about disability, though? Okay. What about disability? Why would anybody think that being disabled is a political category, right? Or it involves the political concern that one's disabled status, their disability status, should be a protected status. Okay, a protected status is something like one's race, right? We're not allowed to discriminate against people on the basis of their race, and that's a good thing, right? That's a protected status. Somebody's gender or sex, somebody's sexual orientation. This is a big one, right? Right? Is that a protected status? Okay, this view of disability has a name. Okay, it's called the mere difference view of disability, right? So this is the idea that somebody is in some bodily state X. Okay, we can just describe it. Maybe you're missing an arm. Maybe you have, some kind of developmental, congenital issue where you're confined to a wheelchair, right? Whatever the case may be, all right? And then what happens is that the rules for making judgments about solidarity, okay, which is employed by the disability rights movement, classify this physical condition in some context as among the physical conditions that are seeking to promote justice for. Okay, that's a mouthful, right? And this isn't unique to me. This is by a philosopher named Elizabeth Barnes. This is her definition of what a disability is that deserves protected status. Is that there's just some way somebody's body is. There's a social movement called the Disability Rights Movement that has a sense of solidarity surrounding that bodily condition, especially in certain social contexts. And they then promote justice for people with those physical conditions in those contexts, right? That's what's called the mere difference view of disability, right? The mere difference view of disability treats disability like homosexuality, like race, like gender. It's a part of human diversity. It should be celebrated. It should be protected. It should not be discriminated against, right? And it's not. And being disabled does not, in and of itself, make you worse off. Now, you might be worse off because you're disabled, but the fault lies with society. Society is what disables, in the negative sense, making you in the sense of making you worse off, right? It's not your physical condition, right? So it's a weird view. It's a little strange. I get it, right? It's kind of hard to wrap your head around, right? But what I want you to understand is, just for purposes of this class, is that it contrasts with the medical model of disability. The medical model of disability is basically one that treats it as involving something that harms you, right? It makes you worse off in virtue of the physical condition, right? The medical model of disability is thought to be a form of ableism. Now, what in the world is that? Well, think of racism, right? Racism is wrong because it discriminates against people negatively on the basis of their race. Ableism likewise discriminates against people of disability status, right, on the basis of their physical condition, right? So that's what it's like, right? And so I want you to think about this idea. What do you think of the mere difference view of disability, right? And how do you make sense of disability pride? So what I want you to do is actually watch this YouTube video, and it'll explain it here. I'll put a little link to it in the video itself, all right, where this disabled person is disabled and proud of it, okay? And so I want you to just listen to what this person has to say, and what do you think about it, right? Do you think that disability, at least some of them, need not be medicalized as diseases to be controlled, okay? I don't know about whether or not this is the case for every disability, right, that we can think of, but at least some of them, all right? I want you to think about this and tell me what you think. How would you make sense of disability pride? Do you think that this is the mere difference view has something to it, or do you think it's confused, all right? Do you think disability is just a medical issue and that's that, right? So that is today's lecture. That's what I want to leave you with. And if you have questions about any of this stuff, please let me know in the discussion Q&A section, or shoot me an email. All right. I'll talk to you later.